everybody. I'm Martha Minow, Dean here at the law school. Thank you for being here to talk about a very serious subject. It is awful that it requires major tragedies to get us together around issues like gun violence, but we have it. And so we're really, really lucky to have a terrific group of panelists. Before we start our panel discussion, first I want to identify Patrick Kibbe, who's a law student here, who's organizing a group of students interested in the subject. And if you're interested in being in a reading group and maybe participating in some reform activity, this is a person to talk to right away. I will introduce our panel in a minute, but the very first thing we're going to do is actually hear from Larry Tribe, who unfortunately couldn't be with us, but he testified in Congress this week about the issue of this panel, and he has shared his testimony with us, and we're going to have a videotape of it. For anyone who doesn't know, Larry Tribe is a university professor here, and he's perhaps as well known as a constitutional advocate as a scholar. He also recently served for a year as a senior counselor for access to justice at the Department of Justice. So without further ado, let's have the tape of Larry Tribe's testimony this week in Congress.
Leave in a quiet manner as they are, and we'll proceed with the testimony. Professor Tribe, I know that you've made a great personal sacrifice to be here with us today, and I appreciate it very, very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nothing like the sacrifice that many of the people that you have invited have made, the victims of violence. Chairman Durbin and members of the committee, I'm honored by your invitation that I testify on an issue of such vital national importance. And it is especially humbling to be here in the presence of so many victims of senseless gun violence and many others who have lost loved ones in a hail of bullets that should never have been fired. When we recall the horror of learning that 21st grade children had been slaughtered in Shady Hook Elementary School, I think we have to remember that every 4 days, nearly 20 more children and more than 100 adults die in gun homicides around this country. We may not know their names or see their faces, but they were not anonymous or nameless or invisible to those who loved them and will never hold them in their arms again. The question before this subcommittee is whether sensible measures to reduce rampant gun violence, not necessarily to stop it, we'll never do that, but to reduce it. The violence that cuts short all these lives is beyond our reach because of the Second Amendment. My answer to that is an emphatic no. Until the 1990s, nearly every constitutional expert, including Chief Justice Warren Burger and Judge Robert Bork, treated the Second Amendment as irrelevant to any personal right to keep or bear arms on the theory that the amendment concerned only each state's well-regulated militia. But by the end of the last century, a different understanding had emerged, one focusing on individual self-defense independent of the militia. I supported the emergence of that new understanding, and the Supreme Court made it the law of the land in the Heller and McDonald decisions in 2008 and 2010. That pair of decisions demolishes the slippery slope theory of those who oppose basically all firearms regulation on the view that once we permit any new firearms regulation at all, we will be inviting the government step by step to come ever closer to disarming the people, leaving only the police and military with firearms. With Heller and McDonald securely on the books, the Supreme Court, in its own words, took certain policy choices off the table and thereby cleared the path for reasonable regulations to be enacted without fear that those policy choices would either open the door to unlimited government control or be imperiled by exaggerated interpretations of the Second Amendment. As Justice Alito put it in McDonald, there is no longer any basis for such doomsday proclamations. Justice Scalia, speaking for the court in Heller, said it at the end of his opinion. Under our interpretation, the Constitution leaves open a variety of regulatory tools for combating the problem of gun violence in this country. Now, the court was explicit in saying what some of those tools include. They include, and each time I'm quoting from the court, conditions and qualifications on the transfer of firearms to keep them out of dangerous hands, including felons and the mentally ill. They include long-standing regulatory measures to keep firearms out of particularly sensitive places. They include complete bans of firearms that are, quote, not typically possessed by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes, such as short-barreled shotguns, and of firearms that are especially dangerous or unusual, such as M16 rifles and the like. That was a list that the court explicitly said was not meant to be exhaustive. They include other regulations designed to protect public safety without cutting into the core right that the Second Amendment protects, the right of self-defense in the home. Those legitimate other regulations certainly encompass bans on illegal straw purchasers and gun trafficking, both of which can totally frustrate any system of background checks or gun registration. And the kinds of regulations that do not trigger close scrutiny under the Second Amendment obviously include universal background checks or registration systems, for the simple reason that systems with loopholes and less than universal coverage are calculated to be evaded by the very people who have no right to bear arms under the Second Amendment, people we cannot safely entrust with lethal weapons. Finally, those other obviously valid regulations, ones that do not trip the Second Amendment's trigger, have to include bans on high-capacity magazines and especially lethal weapons that someone can keep firing for 10 rounds or even more without reloading. Banning those weapons gives people a chance to escape and gives the police a chance to interrupt the slaughter. The category of valid regulations under Heller, in my view, also covers bans on weapons designed for assault or military use rather than for lawful civilian uses. And the court did not merely say that such regulations would ultimately survive Second Amendment scrutiny. It said that Heller would not even, quote, cast a shadow of doubt on such measures, should they be considered in the future. Now, we should have no illusions that adopting measures like these nationally will completely solve the epidemic of gun violence in America. More will be needed. We clearly need to address mental health issues as well as other potential contributors to gun violence, such as violent video games, films that glorify murder and mayhem, and other aspects of our violent culture. But if we do nothing until we can do everything, we will all have the blood of innocent human beings on our hands and will besmirch the Constitution in the process. Just in closing, let me say that our Constitution, as many have wisely observed, does not make the perfect the enemy of the good. And whatever else it is not a suicide pact that condemns us to paralysis in the face of a national crisis of domestic bloodshed. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Professor Tribe.
That gives us a beginning discussion of the constitutional context. We're really lucky to have with us today Professor David Hemenway, who is director of the Harvard Injury Control Research Center. And as a key figure in the public health world, he has brought a public health framework to the issues that we have here today. He headed the pilot for the National Violent Death Reporting System, which provides detailed and comparable information on suicide and homicide. And his really fascinating book, While You Were Sleeping, Success Stories in Injury and Violence Prevention, published in 2009, describes more than 60 successes and over 30 heroes who have made the world safer. Professor Hemingway.
So I have 7 minutes to, I think, explain to you what the public health approach is. So I'm going to talk fast. So the goal really is prevention. So to step back, all we're trying to do is prevent. We're not trying to blame. We're not trying to punish. Indeed, often blame and punishment get in the way of prevention. And typically what we found is that upstream prevention is often much more cost-effective than waiting till somebody is about to do something at sort of the victim or the perpetrator. There are so many successes in public health. People understand analogies, so I'll talk about one analogy which I think is fairly good, and that's the motor vehicle analogy. The goal of really all public health is to try to create a system where it's hard to make errors and where it's hard to behave inappropriately, and then when people still do behave inappropriately and make errors, that nobody gets hurt badly. In motor vehicles, when I was growing up in the 1950s, we were told that over 90% of crashes were due to driver error and that most of fatalities were due to drivers behaving illegally and unlawfully. So what should we do? We ought to do something about the drivers, clearly, and the mantra was education and enforcement. This is exactly where we are in the gun area today, where the gun lobby basically focuses on education and enforcement. And the motor vehicle manufacturers were, in effect, in the 1950s saying, in so many words, cars don't kill people, people kill people. And it really wasn't until the 1950s that public health physicians asked a different question, not who caused the accident, but what caused the injury. And it was clear people were being killed when their chests would go right through the steering column, which wasn't collapsible. Their faces would be lacerated by the windshield, which was not made of safety glass. They were being thrown from the car because there were no seatbelts and no airbags. They would leave the road for 1 second, and they would hit trees and lampposts planted right along the sides of the road. And public health physicians were saying, can't we do something about the cars? Can't we do something about the roads? Can't we have a better emergency medical system? Fast forward 60 years, and nobody thinks the drivers today are better than they were when I was growing up. We're a little better about drunk driving, and if I have time, I can talk about that. We're much worse about road rage. We're worse about texting. We're worse about cell phones and so forth. Fatalities in the United States have fallen over 90% per mile driven. An incredible success story. And again, how is it done is by changing the system. Make it so that when somebody's driving in California on a highway and they sort of start drowsing off and they start weaving a little suddenly, bump, 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 they hit these bots dots which say, wake up, you stupid jerk, get back in lane and don't kill anybody. The same way you want to protect pedestrians, the people are driving too fast, you can have cops on every corner, or you can just change the road. You can put in speed bumps, you can change the configuration of the road, and there are 24 methods of what's called traffic calming, chicanes and neck downs, which without doing any enforcement at all, people drive much, much more carefully and no pedestrians get injured. So what can we do in the gun area to make a difference? In motor vehicles, there's lots of problems that we have to solve because we're going to have lots of motor vehicles. We're going to have lots of guns in the United States, take it or leave it. And in the motor vehicle area, we have problems of pedestrians, of motorcyclists, of bicyclists. We have problems of rollovers. We have problems of rear-end collisions, frontal collisions, side collisions. No one policy protects everybody and everything. We had lots of policies which made a difference. The same way it's going to be in the gun area. There's so many different problems. There's accidents, there's suicides, there's mass murders, there's intimate partner violence, there's gang violence. We're going to have different policies which affect different groups. What can we do? The manufacturers could do much, much more. Right now, for example, they could do much more to reduce homicide, to reduce crime. We have serial numbers on guns in the United States which are not unique, which are easily obliterated, so it's hard to trace the guns. We could force manufacturers to make serial numbers which are hard to obliterate, the same way that car manufacturers were forced, somewhat against their will, to put in airbag seatbelts and collapsible steering columns. We should have ballistic fingerprinting on all guns, which is required now in California. Every time a bullet comes out, you should be able to tell not that this is consistent with a gun, that we should be able to tell that this comes from this particular gun. And that may make some CSI TV shows not so interesting, but it will catch many more criminals. We should make guns which are personalized. Years ago, my car radio was stolen. After that, I bought a car, and in the windshield it said, you can steal this radio, but it won't work. Personalized guns make it so when you steal the gun, and we guess that there are about 500,000 guns a year stolen in the United States, which make it into criminal hands. You can steal the gun, but it just won't work. We can do a lot about, the manufacturers should do a lot more about firearm safety. We have guns which, when you drop, can go off. We have guns which 2-year-olds can shoot. We have made it so it's difficult for 2-year-olds to open aspirin bottles. We can make it very easily that 2-year-olds can't shoot guns. We know in the United States every day kids pull out the magazine of their dad's semi-automatic and they think the gun's unloaded. They, after all, hear the bullets and they point the gun around and bang, they shoot it and they kill their best friend. It happens all the time. What's the solution? You can yell at the kids, you can teach the parents, or you can make it so when you pull out the clip that the gun simply won't fire, and you've eliminated the problem. There's so many things that distributors should do. We should have much better distribution. The ATF has virtually no power to really get rid of scofflaw dealers, and we have some scofflaw dealers. We should have 1 gun per month laws to restrict gun trafficking. Of course, we need universal background checks, and we should make it so that all the distributors, all the licensed dealers follow the lead of the very good licensed dealers who make it very, very difficult for straw purchasers rather than make it easy for straw purchasers. And that's, again, one way in which there's a lot of gun trafficking. Owners should do a lot more. Every other country, every other developed country has a licensure system for gun owners, which we don't. They have safe storage requirements, we don't. They have training, which we don't at the national level. And then, of course, in public health, what we really want to do is change social norms. We can do a lot of things about changing social norms without changing any really laws at all. Sometimes it requires a little changing of laws, and we have incredible examples in the drunk driving area in the United States that can be applied to firearms. And so let me stop with this. Lots of things we can do, and virtually all the things that sensible people want to do are supported by the overwhelming majority of Americans, by the large majority of gun owners, and even often by the majority of NRA members, and we don't have any of those things. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and it's one of the important reminders that a public health approach offers a kind of power that we often don't talk about this side of the river. Professor Ronald Sullivan, known to so many of you, is not only on the faculty here, an alum of this school. He directs the Harvard Criminal Justice Institute, and in his past, he also directed the best public defender service in Washington, D.C. We're very, very glad that you're here, and look forward to what you're going to say. And I like the beard.
Thank you. I'll tell Stephanie. She hates it, so I'll say my dean says it's a good beard. I actually want to pick up where the previous speaker began with this term prevention. So I'll start at the end of the story. As director of the D.C. Public Defender Service, I put into place an office that we call the Community Defender Office. It was heresy in many ways because it was an office that was designed to prevent recidivism. It was an office designed for our clients who were on probation or clients who had been acquitted or clients who were just out of custody from a conviction. And it was run by a social worker, and I had full-time lawyers in the office. And its sole purpose was to ensure that we provided people with resources to comport themselves in ways where they would not come back into the criminal justice system. And even though this was D.C. pre-Heller, guns were plentiful, and gun violence was one of the major areas that we counseled clients on. I say I start at the end of the story because I want to tell you what motivated the decision to start this community defender office, and it's in one of the wards in D.C. where physically it's located, where our clients, most of our clients, came from. But when I was a little older than most of you out here, my first year as a public defender, I represented a 15-year-old boy who was charged with possession of an illegal firearm, and I undertook my duties zealously. I represented the child well. It was in juvenile court. His mother wanted him detained. I successfully argued that given the circumstances, etc., he should be released. And when the time came for the next appearance, client didn't show up. Bench warrant issued. They never found him. Fast forward about 2 months. Another graduate of this school, Robert Wilkins, who's now a federal judge, he was a public defender at the time, came into my office with a newspaper and a grim look on his face. He was my supervisor, and said, showed me an article and said, isn't this your client? It was an article about the young man who had been killed in a gunfight. Fast forward another couple of weeks, I saw his mother in court, and she was with her younger son, who was now involved in the juvenile justice system. And she looked at me and said, "You killed my child. You're the one that got him out of jail." Now, there are many ways you can take this story, and the way I'm not going to go right now is the question of representation and so forth. Just take it on faith that my representation before I think was the right thing to do, and I'm comfortable with that and would do it again if in a similar circumstance. But it certainly got me to thinking that what is the role, if any, of the public defender in terms of addressing this issue that had a devastating impact. I mean, those comments, I sometimes today still wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it, something I will never, for the rest of my life, forget. It was a 15-year-old African-American boy in the district. So what role does even an institution like the public defender have in addressing issues like gun violence? And the point here I'll make in my 7 minutes is that no matter what area you are in, if there is an issue, if there is a problem that is so encompassing, that is so harmful to the community, there are things that you can do. And one of the things that we pushed for as junior lawyers and that I made happen as director was this community defender program. So Larry and my colleague from School of Public Health did a great job of listing out some of the things that we can do. Now, one of the things that we did as public defenders was noticed, particularly among our juvenile clients, that the correlation between bad education and criminality was astounding. It was absolutely astounding. So one of the things we did was hired special education advocates as full-time lawyers to be able to go into court and get educational resources for students. We had social workers who helped with programs and jobs and so forth, from the notion that you have to give people in these particular communities reasonable alternatives to settling matters with a gun, right? And these are important alternatives. But whatever area you're in, you should be able to make a difference, to engage in this debate. So one of the things he mentioned was this electronic fingerprinting of bullets. It's a really easy thing to do. A really easy thing to do, and it certainly would, I think, reduce gun violence dramatically. But that and so many other things, while they're easy to do, one, two, we know about them. We know what sort of solutions work because they work in smaller places, localities or states all over the country. What's missing, though, is the political will to do something nationally, and that, in my view, is a national disgrace. And I hope in the Q&A we will have an opportunity to talk substantively about some of these areas and where they're working and why they're working.
Terrific. So you're starting to get the picture. There's a lot of room for actual public policy that could really make a difference. We might even have political will now that we haven't had. And there are ways in which the different actors in different roles in our society could make a difference. One of the big topics, though, that people talk about is mental illness. Should people with mental illness have access to guns? If they will have access to guns no matter what do we do? And so we're really lucky to have Professor Alan Stone here, my colleague for more years than either of us will admit, the Touroff-Glueck Professor of Law and Psychiatry here at the law school and also at the Faculty of Medicine at Harvard. He's served on the Board of Trustees and as president of the American Psychiatric Association. Besides his expertise in movies and the moral adventure of life, which is the title of his most recent book, he is a long-standing expert in the human brain and behavior and violence. Alan Stone.
Thank you, Dean. I hope I don't depress you all now. Since I have a sort of less optimistic view than the two previous speakers. Most of the mentally ill are not violent. We know that. All of the statistics demonstrate that mentally ill people are not, in general, violent. But in my opinion, most mass murderers are in fact psychiatrically disturbed. And in general, I would say, since a lot of them kill themselves, we don't have a lot of good data. But where we do have data, it seems to me clear that they fit into what I would call the paranoid spectrum. And I think that would include someone like Adam Lanza, who did the killing at Newtown. Now, I want to say something just briefly about the way we talk and theorize about violence. I think it was a big mistake to think of violence as an instinct, of which psychiatrists and psychoanalysts did for a century. Violence is goal-directed behavior. It's not an instinct. It's not a hydraulic energy that has to be let out. It's not something that can be discharged. And the source of violence is our situation in life. It's seen in most cases as adaptive. So I just want you to realize that picking up a gun and shooting is not the result of some derangement of instincts. And that's my view for all of human beings. Now, I want to say a brief word about mass murderers, particularly the ones mentioned by President Obama, or referred to, or alluded to in his State of the Union address. Now, I was, as the dean said, president of the APA, and when I was on the board, they passed what they call the Goldwater Rule, which means I'm not supposed to discuss what I'm about to discuss with you. And I hope you will all turn me in. I voted against this as an ethical rule at the time, and I continue to defend the people who break the rule as I am about to do. So, the first person I want to briefly describe is Mr. Cho of Virginia Tech. Now, Mr. Cho was identified as a disturbed child already in elementary school and middle school. He had therapy. People realized what his problems were. He then went to Virginia Tech. At Virginia Tech, people became aware that he was seriously mentally ill. His teachers were afraid of him. They wrote letters to the dean. The campus police took him to be civilly committed. He was seen briefly by a psychologist and a judge who decided he was not dangerous. And the judge ordered him into outpatient treatment, which did not exist. The second person I want to talk about is Mr. Loeffner from Arizona, who shot the congressman and killed the other people. Mr. Loeffner was doing fairly well in high school, and then, as is often true in mental illness, in late adolescence, early adulthood, he started to become difficult. He also drank to excess and took drugs and hallucinogens. All his friends said he had changed totally, that when you drink and add substance abuse to mental illness, the risk of violence goes up. He was at a community college, Pima Community College there. They were aware that he was mentally ill. And to their credit, they called in his parents and spoke to them. And their way of dealing with this potential problem person was to say, you're expelled until you get a private psychiatric evaluation that says you're all right before you can come back. He never did it. And it was only after he had killed these people that finally there was someone came to terms with the fact that he was mentally ill. And then there's Mr. Holmes in Aurora. Mr. Holmes also was in a college when he became disturbed. He saw a psychiatrist there who thought he was disturbed. She warned the group that is to identify dangerous people, and he left Pima. He dropped out. I'm sorry. He left a campus of the University of Colorado and dropped out, and they did nothing further until the tragedy happened. So in each of these cases of mass murder, the police knew, responsible people knew, faculty members knew, but nothing was done. Why is that? That is because, unlike Sully's program, there is no continuity of care left in the mental health system. Whether you're rich or you're poor, there's no continuity left in the mental health system. It just doesn't exist. Furthermore, we no longer have an adequate public mental health system at all. The three largest mental health facilities in the United States are Rikers Island, Cook County Prison, and Los Angeles County Jail and Los Angeles County Jail. And they do not provide continuity of care either. So I think in terms of the problems of the serious mentally ill and they're getting care, we have an incredibly long way to go. And I don't, there are many other things I could say, but I think my 7 minutes are up.
Well, thank you. One of the best things that happened after the terrible tragedy most recently in Newtown was young people around the country saying, we want to do something. And I'm particularly glad to have our own student, second-year student Robert Cross, as our next speaker, a graduate of Harvard College where he majored in biology. He has been working on issues of gun control, and last summer worked at the Brady Center to prevent gun violence, and worked on a case against the NRA, and worked also to develop a case against a website, Arms List, that facilitates illicit gun sales, and other similar efforts to go upstream, to use Professor Hemenway's view. And I'm going to just quote something that Robert has in his own written biography. He says his experience working at the Brady Center with coworkers, including his friend Colin Goddard, who survived 4 gunshots at Virginia Tech, has inspired him to do everything he can to educate smart, engaged people about the dangerous state of gun law in this country and how we can get involved to change it. Robert, thanks for being here.
Thank you. I want to try to connect some of the things the previous speakers said, sort of to try to address how the public health and the numbers motivate legal change and how the legal change can actually reduce violence in this country. The first thing I want to do is, I think I just want to frame the scope of the problem because we haven't done it yet. More Americans have been killed in gun-related incidents since 1968 when MLK and RFK were killed, and that includes murder, suicide, and accidents, than in every war in this nation's history. Every war. It's almost 1.4 million people. We are literally better at killing ourselves than every foreign enemy we've ever faced combined. How that translates into an annual basis, On average, we lose 11,583 American citizens per year. It's 32 a day. Total gun deaths, and that's just from murders, total gun deaths are 31,537. Over 51,000 people survive attacks with shootings where they're injured, and over almost 16,000 people survive accidental shootings in which they're injured. Total gun injuries per year, over 71,000. And now one thing you won't hear a lot of politicians who talk a lot about fiscal responsibility but seem to be very against gun regulation, they don't seem to talk about the financial cost that gun violence imposes on this country. Medical costs, criminal prosecutions, security precautions like metal detectors, and reductions in quality of life are estimated to cost this country $100 billion a year. Now, you may think that number is a little bit inflated, and it might be, given that I don't know exactly how they're measuring quality of life, but the point is it is a massive economic burden. And there is one reason why we have that burden in this country. U.S. homicide rates are 6.9 times higher than 22 other populous high-income countries combined. Why is that? It's driven by the fact that our firearm homicide rate, not absolute numbers, but the rate, is 19.5 times higher than those other 22 countries combined. So we have a huge problem. What can we do legally? Some of the things we've already have already been addressed that I'm interested in and the Brady Center is interested in and that you've heard a lot about in the recent political dialogue. Universal background checks are incredibly important. I'm going to talk a little bit more about existing legal loopholes and why background checks are not currently universal and why that's such a huge problem. A real assault weapons ban, not like the weak one which lapsed in 2004 and not one that is lapsed. Getting rid of ridiculous state-level gun rights restoration processes that have been introduced as a result of NRA pressure, which have put guns back in the hands of felons, including one case I read about this summer where a guy had been convicted of assault with a deadly weapon. It was a shotgun, so yeah, he should definitely have a gun again. Microstamping, which is Professor Hemingway also mentioned, which is the electronic fingerprinting. Just to give you an idea of how easy that is, Professor Sullivan mentioned how easy it was. Cost estimates from manufacturers, or just how easy it is to do this. Specialized firing pins cost estimates for it range between 50 cents and $6, and they would be borne entirely by the manufacturer. No new databases or examiners would be required, so there's no cost to state governments, and the technology's co-inventor has agreed to offer the technology royalty-free to any gun manufacturer. It is so easy to save lives, and the NRA doesn't want us to do it. But what can we do? What do we actually think is going to work? I'm going to talk a lot about things I think will work, and that's going to be the getting rid of the restoration processes, the microstamping, better regulating online gun sales, which scare the hell out of me, and also maybe we could have an ATF director because we haven't had one for 6 years because Congress has held up the appointments of both President Bush and President Obama to this position. But I just want to address that we actually know that universal background checks and assault weapon bans can work. And not because of theory, not because we can look at the example of Australia where gun control has been quite effective, but because based on the weak, incomplete measures we currently have, the background checks with loopholes, the assault weapons ban that lapsed, we know that in this country, it can and did work. I want to address that really quickly before I finish up, which is, since 1994, the Brady Law, which requires background checks for federally licensed firearms dealers, this is like gun stores who are actually licensed, has stopped over 1.9 million criminals and other prohibited purchasers from purchasing firearms from those FFLs, the people with the licenses. And that's not my word, that's the word of the U.S. Department of Justice. But there's a big problem. The Brady background checks apply only to federally licensed firearms dealers. They do not apply to private sellers. They do not apply to me. They do not apply to an unlicensed seller at a gun show. And it is estimated that over 40% of gun acquisitions occur in the secondary market, i.e. without a federally licensed firearms dealer, without a background check. And it is totally legal. Right now, if Professor Stone and I are both residents in Massachusetts, and he comes up to me and he says, Robert, I'd like to buy the gun that you have on the table in front of you, I can sell it to him, and as long as I don't know or have reason to know that he's mentally ill or a convicted felon or a domestic violence abuser, sorry about that.
Seems a true hypothetical.
True hypothetical. As long as I don't have those things, it is totally legal. Now, who's exploiting this loophole? You know, because it's interesting to look at. One loophole that the NRA's Washington office opposes closing, and I cannot for the life of me understand why people who claim to be patriots would oppose closing this loophole, is people on the terrorist watch list can currently buy guns, but we apparently don't want to close that gap. Convicted felons who would otherwise have to go through a background check can go to these gun sales and get guns, but the NRA doesn't really want to close that and have universal background checks. And the ATF in a 17-month period alone found that over 25,000 firearms had been trafficked from gun shows. Just to give you an idea of what the criminals are doing. People with domestic violence misdemeanors currently barred under the Lautenberg Amendment from owning guns. I have to check whether it's buying or owning, but they're obviously related. They can go to these gun shows, and also, if you have an active restraining order, you aren't covered by the Lautenberg Amendment, and you should feel free to buy a gun. Now, our background checks are only as good as the records they search. As Professor Stone brought up, gun reform is not the only thing that needs to happen. It's one essential step amongst many. Mental health is a huge issue. 80 to 90% of disqualifying mental health records, so this would be people who are mentally ill and violent, are not in the National Instant Criminal Background Check system. So it doesn't matter even if they are violent. They go, they get checked, and they pass because states don't put the records in. 25% of felonies aren't in the criminal background check system. And 10 states don't report domestic violence records to the criminal background system. I can't understand why. I know I can understand, and I know for sure that somebody who was dangerously mentally ill, who should never have gotten a gun, who people know were mentally ill, put 4 bullets in my friend's body. And that's atrocious. And if we can do anything to stop that, we can. We should. 17 states have taken some steps to try to close the gun show loophole, but 33 have taken none. If we know that the incomplete checks we have stopped 1.9 million people from getting guns from federally licensed firearms dealers, don't we think that background checks in this currently regulation-free market might help? And then in terms of the political will, recent polls show that 92% of the American populace supports background checks. And not only that, 74% of NRA owners support background checks, and 87% of gun owners support background checks. People like Wayne LaPierre that you see on TV are not representing Americans, they're not representing the NRA, they're not representing gun owners. They are representing the gun industry, an industry that makes money off of the blood of children. You do not, no, I mean, people laughed like that was funny. It is not at all funny. Like, that is factual. There's no reason to oppose a 50 cent micro-stamping, 50-cent stick dollar micro-stamping thing that might marginally decrease your profit margin unless you really, really care more about money than about the lives of citizens. One other thing with the assault weapons ban, and then I'll wrap up because I've got lots more numbers and stuff to talk about. The 1994 federal assault weapons ban, which I've mentioned, was weak, incomplete, had lots of problems. We did actually do some studies to see whether it worked, and it did, even though it was incomplete. In the 5-year period before the enactment of the ban, assault weapons named in the act constituted 4.82% of the crime guns traced by ATF nationwide. In the post-ban period, after 1995, the assault weapons made up only 1.61% of the guns ATF has traced to crime, a drop of 66%, and there was a steady year-by-year decline in the percentage of assault weapons traced, suggesting that the longer the statute was in effect, the less available the guns became for criminal misuse. Gun control laws work. The idea that if you restrict gun sales or types of guns, all criminals will still get access to these guns is absurd. People like Holmes and Lanza and stuff like this, they lack the social networks and connections that are going to enable them, or a lot of them do at least, lack the social networks and connections that are enable them to go find people who are going to be able to give them illegal guns. And as a final thing, I want to say I've been beating really hard on the NRA because it's not gun owners. It's not NRA members. It's the NRA leadership. As I said, 71% of the NRA wants to close the terror gap. The NRA's Washington office doesn't. The universal background checks we've already gone over. There are responsible gun owners in this country, and we do have the Second Amendment, and we do want to respect it. Nobody is talking about disarming the entire populace. If you as a friend want to have a gun in your home for self-defense, I'm going to try to argue that you shouldn't, because a gun in your home is 11 times more likely to be used in a suicide, 7 times more likely to be used in a homicide or a criminal assault or homicide, 4 times more likely to be used in an accidental shooting than it is to be used in self-defense. But ultimately, it's your call. If you think that the risks are beneath the benefits in terms of your hunting, your collection, ultimately that is your call. But when you bring those guns out into public, or when you think you need an AR-15 to defend your home, it becomes my call, because it impinges on my rights. And even Scalia says that as Professor Tribe mentioned, believes that there can be regulations on the Second Amendment right. It is not unlimited. I'm at the very end going to talk about what you guys can do, what we all can do and should do politically to actually show political will and help lawmakers as they're trying to reform, so that we can pressure our congressmen and show them that this is not something about whether you're rich or you're poor, or whether you're a gun owner or not a gun owner. It's about being an American citizen and saying we, the majority of this great nation, are tired of seeing our children, our students, our coworkers, our friends, and our loved ones being senselessly slaughtered.
Thank you. I'm going to invite you all to ask comments or ask questions or give comments. I'm going to start us off, though, with one specifically to Professor Hemenway. Your analogy to car automobile accidents is so compelling. I'm wondering if there's a kind of research investment that if we made it, that we come up with ideas that we haven't come up with yet. And is that where we should be putting some of our resources right now?
So we do lots of empirical research. We've written 100 articles about firearms, and still our knowledge about this incredibly important public health problem is so limited. We don't have very good data. We really tried to, hopefully we'll get the National Violent Death Reporting System in all 50 states. Hopefully we'll get the CDC to put the gun question back on the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. Hopefully the ATF will be allowed to release information about tracing to researchers. There's whole lots of data that would be nice to have. And it would also, being in a soft money school as opposed to a hard money school, if there's no money for research, people don't do research. What happens is they'll do research whatever is available, money's available. So we have a lot of research on AIDS and obesity now in public health, and very, very little on firearms. There's so much we need to know. I mean, I could make lists of every area. You name it, we don't know it. Does gun training really matter? What do they really teach in gun training? We have no idea. How do criminals really get their guns? We really don't know. We've done work on self-defense gun use, but we really don't really understand self-defense gun use and what's really happening. One of the things that I care a lot about is changing social norms. We don't have a good understanding about how to change social norms among gun owners and among everybody. You scratch the surface. We know a little bit. I mean, even at the very most basic things, we don't know what % of households have guns. I think it's 33% because that's what the Chicago NORC study says, and I think that's the best study. But it's only about 1,000 people every other year. The Gallup poll claims that there's 50%. And if we don't know between 33 and 50%, that's an enormous difference. And has it been going up or down? I think it's been going down, but that's not what the Gallup poll says. We have no idea how many guns there are in the United States. The numbers that's always thrown around comes from our survey, which was done in 2004. And I can tell you our survey has lots of problems with it. Even the most basic things we really don't know nearly enough about. So any more money for research, any increased data would be incredibly helpful. And just while I have the floor for a second, is one of the things in public health is we really believe that it is true that to make a difference, lots of different people have to step up. Lots of different people, lots of different institutions. And so the public defenders stepping up, that's just crucial. But that's just one part. We have people in Massachusetts who are trying to step up. We're trying to get the media to step up. So every time, for example, there's a death, a shooting in Boston, instead of, they just say, who shot whom? In motor vehicles now, whenever there's a motor vehicle death, they tell you whether or not there was alcohol involved, whether or not there's seatbelt use, and that's sort of changing social norms. What we want the media to do is to ask, where did the gun come from? Because these kids in Boston were not raised with guns. Their parents didn't have guns. They can't steal guns because there aren't many guns in Boston. Somebody trafficked the guns in. We have to understand where those guns come from, because the difference between the United States and every other developed country is not that we're more violent. It's not that we have different crime levels, except for guns. And we have by far the weakest gun laws. These kids in Boston, even the kids who have carried guns, you ask them, is it easy to get guns? Yes. What kind of world do you want to live in, where it's easy, difficult, or impossible? The overwhelming majority wanted to live in a world where for them it's impossible for them to get guns, even the kids who have carried guns. And that's what every other developed country has provided for their youth, and we have not. We've made it really easy. So it's like an arms race, and we're all worse off, and they are all worse off, and we're the adults, and we should do something about it.
If anyone wants to make a comment or ask a question, go ahead. I don't see anybody, and so I'm going to ask the next one, which is several people have commented on how, picking up on what Professor Stone said, that violence isn't some instinct, it's a technique for pursuing an objective. Professor Sullivan commented on the importance of education. I'm wondering, is there anything equivalent to the designated driver approach to public health in the alcohol driving situation? Is there an educational solution or some other kind of behavioral step to take, in addition to some of the technological ones that Professor Hemingway talked about before, about how to change the gun design so it's not so dangerous?
I'm sorry, I actually have...
Sure.
So we dealt with a case this summer in Florida where Florida's a lovely state where my parents live now, but occasionally it creates crazy laws. One of these was a physician's gag rule, which essentially made physicians fear for punishment if they tried to talk with their patients about the risks of gun ownership. The Brady Center actually successfully challenged this law, and the judge said that this was a First Amendment issue rather than a Second Amendment one, and that we want to protect free speech between doctors and patients. We have data that people change their gun storage practices after talking to doctors, and that a large number of guns in this country are not stored safely. Either they're unlocked or they're loaded. And given that that is a substantial problem, I think if we had doctors being able to have open and honest conversations and really prioritizing with their patients and not being stifled by idiotic laws like that one, it would be a definite plus.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of social norms that can change. One of the social norms really is, again, about gun storage. I think in terms of friends don't let friends drive drunk, what we really are trying to push and help gun owners change is the notion about guns and suicide. The one area we really know a lot about is that a gun in the home increases the likelihood that somebody in the home will die of suicide, the gun owner's spouse, the gun owner's children. We know that suicide is often transient. People who have attempted suicide in a really serious way and expected to die, they've been followed for 15, 20 years. And what percent of them actually go on to commit suicide? And the answer is less than 10%. If you can get people during this period away from lethal means, that's what a suicide watch in prison does. You can make a difference, you can save their lives. And so what we're trying to do among gun owners is change the social norms so that if your friends don't let friends drive drunk, friends don't let friends who are going through a bad patch, their wives divorced them, they started drinking, they started talking crazy, help get the gun out of the house. And if that had been a social norm in Newtown, even though we have mental health problems, We should do more about mental health. We should do more about parenting. We should do more about our education. We should do more about everything, but we can do lots more about guns. And what would have been really nice is there have been a social norm that if your teenager is going through a really terrible time, you just know, everybody does it, that you just get the gun out of the house for a while. And your good friends would come and say, little Adam, you know, things are really bad for him. He used to sort of be semi-okay, and now all he does is we never see him, all he talk crazy. Let us store your guns for a while. And if that had been the social norm, I think what would have happened is Adam probably would not have committed suicide. His mother would still be alive, and I think 26 other people would still be alive. The difference between the United States and the other developed countries is not because we have terrible mental health problems and they don't. It's that we give such easy access to firearms to anybody.
Yes, identify yourself. And who are you?
My name is Catherine Rebecca. I'm Minow here at Harvard. And I sort of have two questions. So everyone else the first question I had is about background checks. I'm going to bring you a mic. Oh, great. The first question I had is about background checks. The first question I had is about background checks. I have a number of good friends who work on internet background checks in California, and they're aware that there are flaws in background checks. So I'm sort of wondering what kind of duty you think a distributor has when background checks are flawed. Because I think that sometimes when we talk about universal checks, we assume that all of the information is valid, and I don't think that's the case. So I'm sort of wondering about that. And then also, I live in an urban area now, but I used to live somewhere rural, and I think that there's a belief among some rural people that you can't really rely on the police to make you safe. And maybe I think that might be an experience shared by some people in urban areas too, like the sense that you have to have guns because there isn't faith in a rule of law. And I'm wondering what ideas you have about the duty of care, and then also about that sort of safety question, that rule of law question.
Well, I'll take the first one. So that's absolutely right that the universal checks the databases don't contain all of the information. I will just second what Larry said, that we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So two things. One, we should improve those databases, but the fact that they aren't perfect doesn't mean that Congress should not get to work in terms of regularizing the use before any gun purchases, because they will catch some, and that's important. I'll leave the second question for someone else.
Yeah, I got the second one if nobody else wants it. I think you are right that is a cultural sense and a norm shared by a variety of people, both in rural areas and potentially in urban areas as well. The thing is, it is a norm that is completely unrelated to statistical fact. And if you look at both how hard it is for police officers to defend themselves with guns and the stat I gave before of how much more likely a gun in your home is to be used in suicide, criminal assault or homicide, or an accidental shooting than it is to be used in self-defense, it is not a good bet to make to have a gun in your home. Now, a big part of that has to be changing the culture, though, of educating that myth basically isn't real. And I think that's much more a public health and sort of parenting initiative.
You want to comment on that?
So in the first issue, what you really want to do is make it so gun dealers have the same sort of rules, for example, that we have in terms of drunk driving. At bars now, things have changed somewhat, so if someone's really, really drunk, you don't keep plying them with liquor because you've been trained, and you have some liability. At the same way, gun dealers, there's a lot of things that they can do to improve on when you can clearly see that someone should not be purchasing a weapon, or if they're a straw purchasers. And there are some dealers who do really good things, and you want all the dealers to do the right things. In terms of this notion that the gun will make you safer, again, on average, the evidence shows that for the average person, it makes you much less safe. But There may be circumstances where you want a gun. Typically, what you want is protection, and what little evidence there is that you're probably better off with a shotgun than a handgun, and you really need training to what to do, not on how to shoot, but what to do in ambiguous situations when your heart starts beating crazily, and your adrenaline starts flowing, and you're really good for flight or fight, but you're not very good about making rational decisions.
Yes, and here comes a mic, and please say who you are.
Hi, my name is Elsa. I'm a joint degree student at the Kennedy School and the Business School. I'm greedy, so I have two questions for you guys. So the first one is, as a joint degree student, I always see that a lot of public issues where people demonize each other. So the private sector is saying that, the public sector is trying to enlarge your government and trying to control every aspect of citizens' life. And then the public sector said, no, it's all about, these guys are about profits, and so they're not doing what it should be for the world. So I realize there's no business school professor on the panel, but if you were to give us some advice for the business school students, what can the business community do besides the manufacturers of guns? Because right now the business world is kind of a passive receiver of this whole issue, and I feel like even in the business school people are very angry about what happened. So are there other industries that actually can play a role in this? For example, insurance companies or healthcare provider that we could actually make it a more constructive dialogue.
No. Yeah. Sorry. The first thing I just want to address the point you're talking about demonizing, and I feel a little bad because I'm obviously very heated about this, and sometimes I go a little overboard with my attack on the NRA just because they frustrated me a lot this summer. I think you're right that it's important to be nuanced when you're talking about this, and that was what I was trying to do when I was saying it's not about gun owners versus not gun owners. Like, there are a lot of responsible, good gun owners. I have friends who hunt. Like, not demonizing and recognizing that there's actually consensus between the majority of people in the NRA and the majority of the public is very important. In terms of other communities that can be involved, that case in Florida for me is really paradigmatic of how important it is to integrate the health system and healthcare providers into informing people about safe storage habits, risks of guns.
Any employer could do that.
Any employer, yeah, absolutely.
So could I ask myself a question and answer it?
Sure. Well, you get it right, though.
Well, that's asking too much. There's one thing that in the mental health area that I think we could do and we need to do. It's not a big solution, but it's a small step. Most of our civil commitment laws and other laws dealing with the mentally ill have decided that the family is bad, that they have to be kept out of the decision-making process, that they're against the mentally ill person. And I would say, given the lack of continuity of care, given the fact that we have no public mental health system, that the reality is that the family is the first responder. And the family is the only possibility of continuity of care. And we have to start looking at our mental health laws and putting the family back into a position to participate in the care of their children, the care of their children when they're disturbed, the care of family members, in a way totally different than we thought in the 70s and 80s when we made all these laws.
So just one thought connecting both of these comments to the question about what could other industries besides the gun industry do. It does seem to me that sharing with the public and sharing with employees the basic information about what does make a difference in relationship to gun violence would make I think it'd be very empowering. And you could also create incentive programs inside of any kind of workplace for people to store their guns safely, participate in other kinds of activities that would reduce the risks. Did you have comments?
Certainly in the whole area of intimate partner violence, industry can do a lot more than it's doing. And it's a bottom line issue. for industry, because women who are subject to battering, it's the batterer who, not only the person who's the victim, but both of them at their workplaces do much worse, and the evidence is incredibly compelling.
And that's a good example, again, where any employer could be helpful, the same as with Professor Stone's suggestion about dealing with the family around mental illness. Family involvement in supporting a family member who has any kind of illness turns out to be very, very helpful to the bottom line of any business, and so that would be true here, too.
I'd like to speak to one other problem about getting more names, getting more access, right?
Okay.
So recently, New York passed a law which is called SAFE in response to this. And it's the Secure Ammunition and Firearms Law. Now, what it says is that almost every mental health worker, if they, in their reasonable judgment, think someone is likely to be a danger, that they are to report this to the head of community services. And the head of community services, I don't know by what measure, is to decide that this is reasonable, and they are to forward it to the security police I don't know what to do, what they're going to do with it. They're going to decide whether they should not have a gun or what have you. But I imagine thousands of names being sent by people who don't want to get into trouble for not obeying the law. I have no idea how the person who's the head of community services is going to be able to process it. And then I don't know how they're going to, even if they get people in the registers, how they're going to keep people who are mentally ill from getting guns, particularly if they're paranoid. So I do think that now, the interesting thing, just for legal purposes, is that provision passed by New York conflicts with HIPAA. The Healthcare Portability and Privacy Act, because in their language, the person has to be imminently dangerous before you can release any name, right? So now I just point out to you that this represents two moments in American culture and legal culture. One, when we're desperately concerned about protecting the rights of the potentially mentally ill, dangerous person, and we built a wall of legal restraint against that, and we made privacy a total god. And now we've switched to the other side after this tragedy, and we want every possible name of anyone who could be dangerous. And I've seen model statutes now that say high school students, everybody should be required to report anybody who's dangerous. Now,
Robert wants to respond.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't actually think that's our position at all.
I didn't say it was your position. I said it was the position of the legislation.
Okay. I agree that if the New York laws, as you framed it, that goes that there are definitely problems where you can frame statutes too broadly, and the goal is to strike the appropriate balance between individual freedom and social safety, and that law may go too far. But I don't think that this is sort of, again, the perfect being the enemy of the good. I don't think that just because it's notoriously hard for mental health professionals to evaluate who's actually going to become dangerous, that we shouldn't try to institute measures like that. And I think that there are lots of things we can do. The one thing I took issue with also, you said you're not sure how we're going to stop mental health patients from getting guns, especially if they are in fact paranoid. There's a reason that Holmes went to a legal gun store to buy that AR-15. It's because he didn't have a friend or a family member or somebody who he could just borrow the AR-15 from, who he trusted and believed. He went to a legal gun store, and the fact that that gun, which would have been illegal in 2003, before the ban lapsed in 2004, he would not have been able to get. And I think we can stop mental health patients.
I think we have time for one more question, and I also want to remind everybody that Patrick Hibby is here and is a point person if people want to be involved here at the law school in doing work and research in this area. Did you have one? And just say what your name is.
Garth Sheldon Colson, 2L. Question for Professor Stone and Sullivan about anti-recidivism programs and continuity of care. If we wanted to do that right, what would we look for in terms of a model, and what would it take in terms of resources? Is there anywhere to look internationally or domestically at programs that really work, and how would we sort of extrapolate what it would cost to scale up, true good continuity of care and anti-recidivism programs?
Go first, Ellen.
So I think there are a few programs which desperately try to provide continuity of care, mostly by having caseworkers who follow the patients and who provide the continuity of care. But there's a problem with it. Those programs work. But the problem is that caseworkers are young people who do this like people go teach America, right? They do it for a few years and then they leave. So there's huge turnover in the system. So it's not a simple thing to find people who are going to provide continuity of care. And I think, I do think, however, that those of you who are sitting here thinking this has nothing to do with me, I would say continuity of care in medicine itself is desperately lacking. Desperately lacking at this point.
Professor Sullivan?
So I would just say to the resource questions, a lot, unfortunately, and that is can be some of the problems in terms of generating sufficient political will to get. So my program is the program that I started years ago is unique in public defenders, and we got a grant from DOJ, and then Congress funded the rest. But it's unique. Most places don't get that sort of funding, so it can be expensive, this notion of continuity of care, but it's worth it in the long run. And I'll just make one sort of final observation based on what many have said here. So the solutions to the problem require both us thinking about behavior and structure. And so much of the debate is this sort of either or, the question or laws and rules, or no, it's, people kill people and so forth. It's more of a both and consideration. We have to figure out ways, like what Alan's talking about, to get at behavior. But we also need structure in place, and politicians are going to have to pay for it. Right, citizens are going to have to pay for it, and get structure in place to regulate behavior. So it's both of these things working in a conjoint effort. It's going to that in the end will put a dent in this gun problem.
It's been a superb panel, and as we end, I guess as difficult and depressing as the subject is, I am struck by how many very practical solutions have been identified here today, and they range from the not so expensive efforts to regulate the actual design of guns to produce more safety so that a 2-year-old can't accidentally set off a gun, and other similar safety devices, the electronic fingerprinting, regulations of sales and resales, the regulation of background checks, the regulation of gun ownership, licensing, the training of gun owners, the regulation and norm development about the storage of guns, and the treatment of communities of students and communities where people know people who have mental illness, so that there's better ways to deal with the knowledge that's already present in a community about who's at risk. So there are lots of very practical things that could be done. This is a moment when there's political will. And I really am very, very grateful to this panel, and I hope that you'll join me in thanking them.